A course in philosophy and human values may seem paradoxical because philosophy was that discipline in our traditions, that's Western traditions, Western civilization, that began with the search for unconditioned knowledge, unconditioned by human knowledge of things that transcend this world or any other. That tradition is very much alive in philosophy today, mostly in formal logic and mathematics, where it seems in place. And professional philosophers have a name for that tradition. It's the analytic tradition in philosophy. A course in philosophy and human values has very little to gain from that tradition. And the reason for that, I think, is quite simple. It's because philosophy and its interaction with societies, cultures, and in its historical context is very difficult to quantify. It's very difficult to turn into a logical formula. And as a matter of fact, no one, I think, and I've met a lot of philosophers since that's what I do for a living, has ever demonstrated that a deductive argument, a logical argument, one that's purely formal, has ever solved a single philosophical problem, except internally, the ones they made themselves. It's kind of like housekeeping, where you spill the stuff and then you clean it up and you spill it again. And a lot of analytic philosophy is like that. What I'd like to try today is to do something a little different, and that's to place philosophy in a historical context and then go through that and follow the mutation of problems centered on what it means to be human, a question that for me will begin with a kind of skeptical attitude. In other words, we won't begin as though we know what human nature is, a common and, I think, absolutely insidious kind of fallacy promulgated especially in a society like ours that's capitalist and so on, where subjects need to be of a certain kind in order to function in the state and in the economy. So it's important in a society like that to have a rigid definition of what human being is for a whole host of reasons that I hope will become apparent. But I'd like to begin with it as a kind of skeptical questioning, and so I'll come to my first topic. A book standardly used in introductory philosophy courses, and one that I'll refer to only briefly today, is The Trial and Death of Socrates by a little-known author named Plato. Socrates inaugurates the Western philosophical tradition in a very interesting way, and one of the ways he does it is by separating philosophical discourse in a kind of a way from scientific discourse. We can think of the earliest Greek philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaxagoras, and others who studied the cosmos. And I think you're familiar with the word cosmos from other famous television shows. I mean, you've heard Carl Sagan, cosmos, you know, and that is kind of the way you need to say it for the Greeks too, because we get other English words from cosmos, for example, cosmetic, where for the Greeks, the cosmos was sort of cosmetic. It appeared, and that was enough, and it appeared to be harmonious and beautiful and orderly. That made it an object of study. If it had appeared chaotic to them, it wouldn't have been an object of study. It was its order that made it possible to study it. And we know from, at least we think we know, from the text, that when Socrates was young, he studied in this tradition and was interested in the cosmos, in what things were made of. And the Greeks had rather simple answers. Things were made of fire, some thought of water, some thought of earth, fire, water, and air, and various other accounts. And for a rather long time in Western civilization, the account that there were four elements, earth, fire, water, and air, was the dominant scientific account for a long time. In any case, Socrates began in this tradition, but he inaugurates philosophy in the spirit in which I hope I'm going to talk about it for the next few hours, by changing the focus away from the investigation into the movements of stars and the composition of the earth, and directs the investigation of philosophy towards human beings. And this should be well known. I mean, it's an ordinary thing to know about Socrates. Know thyself, for Socrates, was the beginning of wisdom, and Socrates, for him, this was more than a mere motto. All the Socratic dialogues are, in a sense, it's important to understand first that they're dialogues. They're written in dialogic form. In Greek society, and this will be my first amateur sociological remark, in Greek society, knowledge comes to be in a public place where reasoned arguments have to take place in the open, in a public forum. That's to be greatly contrasted, just by point of contrast, with a society like ours where most of the important arguments that shape our destiny are secret. In Greek society, that's unthinkable because a polis is a place where the only force that a free person is supposed to recognize is that peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. That's what differentiates you from a slave. You don't argue with slaves in Greek society. They obey, and you tell them. But when it's a discussion among free citizens, they can't recognize your force as part of the argument. It has to be that strange, unforced force that happens when someone just convinces you with an argument that you go, wow, I think that's better than my argument. I think you're right. So the dialogues are built on that form of political life, where dialogue is essential to knowledge. Later in the course, when we discuss the rise of modern society, we will get a peculiar new way of human beings understanding themselves, a way that, that I'll attach the name Descartes to right now, a way where you sort of introspect and figure things out. Sort of a forerunner to Shirley MacLaine, except more sophisticated. You kind of introspect and sort of talk to your own inner self. Well, for the Greeks, this was no way to achieve knowledge. It was through talking with other people, and I don't want to make this sound sort of too, I don't know, prep schooly, because if you read the dialogues, Socrates is flirting with both the men and the women that he talks to. Mostly talks to men. This is Western tradition, right? So it's the women are, I guess, doing the housework and showing up, in the jail cell when he's about to die and stuff, and whining or whatever. However these guys wrote it, That's why I'm a little dubious about some of the texts. In any case, the two important points that I hope that I've sort of moved around. One, Socrates turns the investigation of philosophy towards human concerns and away from the cosmos. And that already begins a fateful distinction that will later be discussed in, I guess the book was in the 40s or whatever, C.P. Snow's book, The Two Cultures, okay? The culture of science and the culture of the humanities. That split has its origin, in a way, in Socrates turning his attention away from sort of one of the cultures, the culture that was going to investigate nature and human beings as though they were simply in it somewhere, and the culture that investigates human beings qua human, in other words, as human, and as opposed to as one species among other whatever. So and then that makes knowing yourself a crucially important part of knowledge. Now, to make this as simple as I can, I love to use references to movies. I mean, not many of us read anymore, but a lot of us go to movies. In Superman 1, okay, let's get down to a real case, okay? In Superman 1, little baby Superman is flying from the very sophisticated planet to Earth, and there are all these knowledge crystals, and I didn't like the series that much, okay, so don't frown at me, it's not that great a movie, I'm just illustrating here. These knowledge crystals tell him all the known physics of this advanced civilization. But the last and most precious crystal that he gets in the ship is symbolically important. It says, now that you know all this, all these things, you may want to know what is most important, and that's who you are. And so the last crystal is supposed to give him the Socratic style of knowledge. So Socrates believed, and this is a nice illustration, because Socrates believed that one could have all the other kind of knowledge and be totally lost, totally aimless, if one didn't have the other kind of knowledge, which was knowledge of oneself. And this is nice to remember today, I think. It's a cautionary tale, because we live today in a society saturated with information, just information, which I would want to radically distinguish from wisdom or knowledge, but just saturated with information. But I think in our society, the Socratic question is not only difficult to answer, but even a sense for its importance is being lost. We're just saturated with information. We're told so frequently who we are given a certain set of roles that are prearranged, pre-established, and within which in a free society one is able to vary slightly. In other words, to give you an example, we all know what a yuppie is, but we know within that category there's some variation possible. You could be sandy-haired or red-haired. You could wear black Reeboks or white ones. I mean, you know, there's a little, but this is, I'm trying to give you a sense for the strange distance between, historical distance, between the Socratic search for wisdom and this kind of way of finding out who you are. It's very different. It's a very different thing. Okay, let's see. Should I finally throw in an argument? No, not yet. Socrates, in the dialogues, his primary antagonists are called the sophists. And the best historical analogy for the sophists, and I don't like to use the word the way most philosophers do, is pejorative, because the word sophist, they were simply folks who went around and they taught things. They taught how to do well in the marketplace, business school. They taught how to win your cases in the law court, law school. You know, they taught how to run the state well, public policy at Duke or wherever. So, you know, I mean, they went around and they got paid for doing this. In fact, it's interesting that at the trial of Socrates, his one defense that's really convincing that he's not a sophist is that he doesn't get paid to teach. Of course, under that rubric in our society, we're all sophists, right? Everybody in front of a podium at every university is a sophist, whether they belong to the National Association of Scholars or not. They're still getting paid, and the presumption by at least some Greeks was that if you got paid to say something, it was to be taken with a great deal of suspicion. So that was a defense of Socrates. Well, the sophists had a general view that backed it up that I think today, again, is a view that we can understand in our own time. The sophist position is stated variously by various sophists. I'm not going to run through the various ones. In most of the dialogues, Socrates, his interlocutor will be one of them. In most of the Socratic dialogues, he'll be talking to one of these people. But Protagoras is the best known sophist, and his view has come down and has become very famous, and it is, man is the measure of all things. Now, that is an ambiguous statement. It's one that Socrates wanted to point out the ambiguity in. Man is the measure of all things can be read in a modern ear that sounds like individuals, a constructed historical category, by the way. Individuals are the locus of knowledge. And you've heard that argument, I'm sure, in regard to art, for example. Someone will say, well, you know, I don't know what art is, but I know what I like, and that's a knockdown argument in art, a lot of us think. You know, I happen to like Mel Gibson's Hamlet, you know. It's weird, I like it, but, and that's supposed to be a knockdown argument. On this argument by the sophists, though, knowledge is impossible because each individual will have, just like a nose, an opinion and a right to it. And no one's will be more right than the other. That's one way to understand his position. Another more sophisticated way to understand Protagoras is for him to be saying something like this. Each tribe or culture's standards of knowledge will be the standards that will hold for that tribe or that culture. That's a more sophisticated version of what some philosophers like to call relativism. Now, Socrates is a very peculiar person, and I'll connect this back up with human values in a minute, because Socrates won't accept either version of the relativist argument. And in our context, one would think that would make him a dogmatist. I mean, because we're all, I think, immersed in a culture of what I might call sophomoric relativism. By that I mean we go, well, that's my opinion, damn it. You know, sort of like interviewing someone for USA Today. Well, that's what I think, damn it. You know, little nuke over Baghdad, damn it. You know, and old Henry goes, well, that's old Bill's opinion. You know, I respect that. And in a democracy, we're supposed to be democratic about knowledge, you know. Right? Well, everybody's got a right to be a damn fool. And I'm not opposed to that necessarily. I just want to point out that that doesn't end debate, right? I mean, you can still argue with old Henry or old Harry or old Sam, or you can tell I've been in North Carolina too long from these names. Anyway, Socrates' position was that the relativist had to be wrong, but it didn't follow from that Socrates himself had to know the absolute truth. In other words, Socrates thought that he absolutely knew there must be some truths that were absolutely important for human beings, without making the further claim that he knew what they were. See, the further claim is what I like to call the Jerry Falwell claim. I'm not a relativist. There are absolute truths, and by God I know them, where the by God is more than a mere, you know, conjoining. I mean, it's really by God I know them. Well, Socrates held a position that was neither one of these. There must be absolute truths, but I myself don't possess them. Now, that gives the explanation, and I'm sure all of you have read a Socratic dialogue at one time or another. Most people have been forced to at one time or another, right? Kind of peculiar, but most people have been forced to read one. And it's irritating to read this old man's questioning. We need to remember Socrates was very ugly, according to the bust, you know, of his face. It's kind of like me, sort of short, fat, ugly, irritating person. And as Nietzsche said, to be ugly in Greece was already an objection, you know? And, I mean, I guess that's where the modern word for Greeks comes from on university campuses, right? Because to show up ugly is already, you know, you're out. And so to be ugly in Greece was already an objection. Socrates is fat, ugly little guy. As I say, had these, engaged in this practice of questioning. And it's irritating to read them because you go, oh, well, those questions just run in circles. Have you ever got that feeling when you read them? It's just silly. You know? That's not getting anywhere. It's a kind of an American response, you know. What's he getting at, you know? When's he going to get around to it? Well, the Socratic procedure, the dialogues, may not be to get around to anything. Just the pure charm and beauty of the talk may itself contain a glimmer of truth or transcendence. It's not necessary in all the dialogues that he get to something. I mean, the power of thought just for its own autonomy and its own beauty might be something the Greeks were interested in conversation for its own sake. We're a little too busy now for that kind of thing, but just for its own sake it might be interesting. So Socrates held this position, as I say, a middle ground position, which is that there must be absolute truths, but he didn't know them. Why that's important is that gives a reason for the dialogues. When Socrates questions people about beauty, honor, justice, truth, I finally mentioned the big words, philosophies after, right, you know. When he talks about them, and they all sound like pompous words today, I just feel crazy, you know, discussing philosophy today. Because in a society sort of where, as one modern philosopher put it, cynical reason prevails, the very use of these words is bound to just sound like advertising slogans. That's the objective context within which people who try to teach what I teach have to fight a kind of historical battle. Because, I mean, how in the hell can I compete with, well, I'm on television right now, hello. No, how can I compete with a huge media and advertising industry that uses these same words, that used to code the most important things about human beings as the characteristics of products, which you can get in a mediated way by consuming them? See, it's just so difficult then to re-establish sort of their meaning. But for Socrates, it was crucially important to try to get at the meanings of these words: truth, beauty, goodness, courage, justice, and so on. And it was important not only for its own sake, but for what it would tell him about himself and about his fellow citizens. So it was a profoundly civic act. Thus, when Socrates was found guilty at his trial, he suggested that the state should not execute him or even send him to exile, but rather should put him up as a public figure to be supported by the state forever for the service he performed for it. Okay? Which, in a Greek trial, that was not a good counter sentence. That was liable to irritate the jury, right? You know, could really tick off the jury. It didn't seem to hurt in the Ollie North affair, but, you know, Socrates probably didn't have that good a speech coach or whatever. In any case, let me give you the argument that Socrates gives against relativism, because it's one of our little philosophical tricks we learn from him, and may itself be a piece of sophistry. But against people like Protagoras, Socrates would argue as follows, and this is probably familiar to at least some of you. He would take the proposition, the truth, for example, being one important concept, the truth is relative, about which he would ask Protagoras, is the sentence you just uttered, the truth is relative, itself a relative truth, or an absolute one? Well, if Protagoras or some other sophist responds that it's an absolute one, then there is such a thing as absolute truth, and they've discovered at least one of them, that the truth's relative. On the other hand, if the truth is relative, then if you hold Socrates' view that there is such a thing as absolute truth, you're absolutely right too. You see how the dilemma works? Either way the relativist responds, a space is opened up in which it's possible to search for truths that transcend the here and now. Because if either there's one absolute truth, that there aren't any, so then you might begin to say, well, there might be others. You figured out one. Maybe I could too. On the other hand, if you respond the other way, then at least a view like Socrates is still absolutely right, because everybody's absolutely right. So of course Socrates is too. So this famous sort of self-referential problem continues this day to be a sort of thorn in the side of what I would call sophomoric relativism. It really is a problem for that position. Okay, back again now to the human meaning of the Socratic project. And now I'm going to do just a little biography, which is not really, well, biography of this kind is supposed to have a little philosophic import. Not only was Socrates ugly and sort of a pain in the behind, but the people that he questioned on the various topics, in order to find out more about himself and about his fellow citizens, were experts. And this is another point where I would like to contrast us with modern society. It's really hard to imagine a citizen publicly confronting Dan Quayle and being allowed to go on for 30 minutes on the, well, since Quayle reads the Republic, he reads Plato, so you ought to be able to do this, right? Or what is it that he tries to read Plato? That's I guess that's different. But anyway, to get a Socratic parallel, you'd need to imagine another free citizen encountering him and going, what is statesmanship? See, all the Socratic dialogues are sort of the Socratic ones. Plato writes other later dialogues. The Socratic dialogues are all of the form, what is X? Where the X in question will be one of these important words to human beings. So you go, what is statecraft or politics? And he will go to someone who is understood to be an expert by the society. I mean, they'll be in that. If it's courage, he'll go to a general and ask, what is courage? Now, I think how Socrates got in trouble, other than being ugly and irritating, was that as he questioned these people, it became apparent that they didn't have the faintest idea of what the hell they were doing, which is a feeling I get every time I walk into a mall. I look at people, and I just would like to say, what are you doing? And, you know, after you get the word shopping, what the hell do you suppose they'd say? Well, it's Saturday, and everybody's got to be somewhere, and, you know, I mean, Socrates would like nail you and keep going with that what are you doing question, where what are you doing carried the connotations of more than just right now, but what are you doing with your life? What's it about? Does it have a theme? Is there anything important going on? Which is an even more important question today when the planet is full of more people, right, than have lived in the whole previous history of the world. We need an answer to that just to justify taking up the amount of air we do. There's so many people on the globe, we're in somebody's way right now. So it's good to have an answer to the question of what the hell are you doing? So philosophy, I'd like to start this course with the banal question that we should at least try to develop some answer in our own life to a question as simple as what the hell am I doing? And you would be surprised. I mean, some of you go, well, I know what I'm doing. Well, Socrates' presumption was that if you thought about it long enough, you wouldn't be so sure. You wouldn't be so sure about it. In any case, I was talking about how he got in trouble, and trying to get in a little trouble too, maybe. Socrates would confront a general, a statesman, a poet, you know, great artist. What's great art? Well, we know the kind of answers you get there. Have you ever read the interviews with William Faulkner? Aren't we all glad that he wrote that he didn't know what he was doing? Because if he was doing what he said in his interviews he was doing, the books would have been just, ugh. But because he didn't know what the hell he was doing, we were lucky. The books are great. Thank God they're not as stupid as what he said about them. See? And Socrates so would ask a poet, what are you doing? And the poet would just say something completely off the wall stuff, and thank goodness that they expressed themselves as poets and didn't have to explain themselves. But the Socratic drive was to get people to explain themselves. Now, a social thing that happened in Greece that was unfortunate for Socrates was that the young would gather around to listen to these conversations. And you can imagine a scene something like this with some young people gathered around, Dan Quayle forced not to leave and nobody to pull him away, in a 30-minute discussion with at least a clever person like Socrates about statecraft. One can imagine a sort of 15 or 16-year-old today raised on Public Enemy and MTV, the kind of hilarity that might arise and the irritation that Quayle might feel trapped in such a situation. He would consider it trapped, but for the Greeks it would be of the essence of being a free person to be in a situation of dialogue like that. In any case, it's another difference. In any case, this got him in a lot of trouble and was another factor that led up to the rather dramatic title of this book, which is really a collection of the various dialogues about the trial and death of Socrates, which led up to his trial and subsequently being sentenced to death. So philosophy has, in terms of human values, I think, a rather noble beginning. It begins in a quest for meanings that transcend the here and now. These, for me, are not necessarily universal, and certainly have more to say about local conditions than universal ones. I do think we can make historical comparisons. I've been doing that pretty routinely up here. But he thought that these questions had something profoundly important to tell us about what human beings were. Now, one further point that I want to make about Socrates and about the Greek way of life as it will be presented throughout here. And this is by way of sort of distancing myself from a rather standard presentation of Socrates. We now know that what are called the Greeks, and what I've been referring to as the Greeks, we know from the scholarship of African Americans and others that this was largely, and my whole lecture's been based on this text, and I don't mind evoking these Greek values because I think they're still very important, but you should have this note of suspicion, and that's that largely it was 19th century German scholarship that, as it were, invented the Greeks for us. I mean, at one time they were just, you know, like in the 16th century, they were one among other earlier civilizations, you know. The 19th century Germans, I don't know if you know this, were extremely impressed with the Greeks. It's kind of obvious if one looks at their art or reads their literature, right? They were very impressed with the Greeks and what they found out about them. In any case, the Greeks as understood today through that tradition is the only possible topic that I can bring up here. Because in a certain sense, and this is not a relativist argument, the past is only accessible through readings and reinterpretations of the past in the absence of a time machine. I mean, I think that's at the basis of our wonderful time machine fantasy about history, is all of us would kind of like to know what it was really like. You know, what was it really like? The trouble with the past is it's kind of like the present. We don't know. We don't know what it was really like. And a further worry is that even if we had been there, the odds that people who have been socialized to speak an informational language, not to seek these things that are advertising slogans to us, it's very doubtful we'd understand what the hell was going on if we were there. Might sound as peculiar as it does to my students to be forced to read these things. And they say, what the devil is that? All this time talking about beauty, or what is goodness, I mean, good grief. I would like to now make a historical point about something that philosophers today are more aware of than they used to be, and which is important. not all kinds of inquiry can appear in just any setting. There are conditions for the possibility of certain questions being asked. And in the case of Greek society, they went along with a relatively unproblematic discourse for quite a while, especially during the very high days of their empire, when their empire was really in a secure position. In that social setting and under those social conditions, there was no Socrates and no condition for the possibility of there being one. And here's why. Because in the sort of classic Greek language, the one that comes out of the, the oral tradition of Homer and others, it would be insane to ask something like, what is courage? Because the response, which many of you may have had in the back of your mind as I was speaking, would be, don't you have a dictionary? In other words, we know what it means. We've got a cohesive society. We're unified. It's like about the war now. We're all together on this. We know what courage is. So there would have been no space for the Socratic inquiry. It was only after a rather unpleasant experience in a war, Greek war, someone may know about it, kind of a famous war. Good journalist back then, too. Thucydides, fairly decent journalist. Could have got a job with the Post, probably. But after a tragic experience with the war and a military dictatorship, the words that had become standard in their culture and had been used unproblematically with meanings attaching to definite positions began to be sources of irritation, and so the ground and the possibility for Socrates' inquiry was not really his individual genius, although that itself is a nice thing, and I'm not against it, but it was not possible except against a background of a society that had deeply begun to question what these words really meant. And one can't help but think, for example, to try to make this parallel come alive, that the radical questioning that's been going on in the universities about the canons of knowledge, the instruments of knowledge, has not been profoundly affected, as Time magazine admits. But no, it's clear that the current struggle over the canon and the meaning of these classic texts, all of which I've selected only classic texts for this course. I'm not going to read them necessarily or discuss them in necessarily a classic way. But the point of all this questioning is that after this country's experience in the 50s and the 60s of both the civil rights movement and anti-war movement, counterculture, and so on, it became again a problem to say, what does it mean to be, for example, a good woman? Well, there was something sort of in 1951 that meant that clearly is a matter of debate now. Okay? Is that clear? Is that a good example? It's pretty clear. Well, I'll pick one that's a little more controversial. What's a patriot? Became a matter of debate. In sort of 1954, it was not all that confusing. And I'm old enough to remember people not being confused by it. I think people want it to be non-confusing again, desperately. They may want it more than they want even money, which is amazing. But the point is that philosophy, philosophical inquiry of the dangerous kind, as opposed to of the analytic, boring, academic kind, philosophic inquiry of the dangerous kind catches a society at a moment when it's insecure about what the main terms that hold it together mean, like man, woman, patriot, and in particular human being. So that is the human edge of philosophy, is that you catch society at a moment of danger when a term or set of terms that are very important to the identity of a lot of people are in question, are possible. The questioning of them is at least possible. It may be that we are today, and since I'm trying to remind myself as I talk about eternal values and not being a relativist, and I do think it's important to search for values that transcend the here and now. On the other hand, in the time since Socrates, we have become more dubious about eternal ones. Me too. We're all more dubious about those. But I would like to look for values that transcend the here and now, and for obvious reasons. The obvious reason in my case being that I think the ones that prevail here and now suck. Good English word, right? So we all know what that means. By the way, it's interesting to note, sidebar here for you amateur philosophers who want to read more books of this kind, most of the texts are translated to get those kind of words out of them. But the language spoken by Socrates, as recorded by Plato, is not a fancy language just filled with technical terms, but is a pretty ordinary Greek. And it's only later, sort of mid-20th century or early 20th century, when philosophy starts to develop a professionalized vocabulary. See, in all its previous history, it tried to communicate with at least some class of people. It's only recently that it tries to communicate with no one. I mean, the Journal of Philosophy, if 12 people go down on the same flight, there won't be any more Journal of Philosophy, because 11 guys write it for this other guy. And that's, you know, so what I'm trying to do today is to broaden out the interest of philosophy a little more than that, to the extent that it means anything more than another niche in an intellectual marketplace already filled up with so much garbage you'd be lucky. It's kind of like a big sale. You're lucky to find the scarf you want because it's just filled with crappy scarves, and there's one you might want. And so all I can do is to make philosophy and its kind of inquiry, insofar as it's critical, insofar as it catches a society at a moment of danger, insofar as it asks us who we are and who our fellow citizens are. I want to make that look important, like an attractive scarf in the pile. I'd like to be able to give it more punch than that, but then I'm speaking in the here and now, in quite a dark moment of the history of this country, in my opinion. One I would discuss at length, but I will in the question period and outside in the hall and in public forums to the extent that it's still allowed to do so. The first lecture, I wanted to just introduce you to some of the themes I'll pursue throughout the lecture. What does it mean that the grand theme, and one that I certainly won't answer as these lectures progress, is what does it mean to be a human being? I will try to localize the question. Today I've tried to say what it was like, in a way. What was it like? How did the Greeks understand a certain set of human practices? And I've said almost nothing about it except about the practice of Socrates. So as we go through these lectures, I'm going to lay out various what I will call ways of living. And the Socratic way is one of critical inquiry. And this shouldn't be understood in the way we understand inquiry today, as just sitting on your butt and looking through a microscope. No, inquiry in Socrates' sense, critical inquiry, is to go around in a kind of passionate search for what's really important, where that itself is up for grabs. It's not like you know what that is for sure. Socrates doesn't just ask what's truth and beauty and the good. He has one dialogue where he asks what's fine. And the best translation would sort of be the English fine, in the sense of, boy, you're fine, or isn't that fine? And so that doesn't, you know, that doesn't sound like truth or beauty. The dialogue is about what's fine. So I mean, Socrates goes around looking for these things in order to get a fix on what is important about being human, what's special about it, in order also, finally, to disprove the Delphic oracle, who, when asked who was the wisest man in the world, said Socrates, and this was reported to him, and he went, this is nuts, can't be true, I don't know anything. And he finally figured out the riddle of the oracle. He was only the wisest man in Greece because he not only didn't know anything, but he had a meta-belief about that. He knew that he didn't know anything. Very important distinction. And as I make some of the rather dogmatic remarks that I'm going to make through the lecture, I should make my own position as a philosopher clear. I'm not a relativist, and I'm not an absolutist in the sense in which I've discussed them today. I'm a fallibilist. That means something like this. A fallibilist is someone who passionately believes certain things. Passionately believes certain things. Some of them quite bizarre, as you'll find out as we go along. But about those beliefs, I believe that they could be wrong. a peculiarly modern attitude, but one that I find myself forced to. Through long and bitter historical experience, not only philosophical, by the way, but historical in a more bloody and mundane sense, it seems only wise policy, both philosophically and politically, to be able to hold a belief passionately, but to have a belief about that belief that it could be wrong. Some of you may think that that's absolutely paradoxical, that if one must believe something passionately, then you've got to just believe it. And I hope that turns out to be wrong, because it doesn't seem to make me feel any more schizophrenic than the rest of you to both know that I hold a series of beliefs quite deeply, and yet to have a belief about them at another order that they could be wrong. I mean, I hope that that will work. Anyway, in any case, that's not a bad characterization of the position of fallibilism. And I'm a fallibilist about fallibilism. Let me go ahead and go a little further, which means that that whole stance could be wrong. So I'm a fallibilist all the way down, see? Because even that way of looking at knowledge could be wrong, and so on. And to be philosophical is not to stop pursuing a question when it becomes inconvenient. It is the opposite in that sense. The kind of inquiry I want to pursue is kind of the opposite of a televised news conference, where everyone knows the limits of questioning and obeys without question like slaves and lackeys beneath the level of humanity or free human beings. It ought to make us ashamed. But philosophy doesn't behave in that way. Not at its best. It has been known to. In fact, like religion, it has frequently served the powers that be. I'm trying to pick out a certain group of philosophers that at their best don't do that. Okay? At their best, they question radically. But I'd like to distinguish that from, say, a news conference, where the spectrum of questions are quite simple and very, very prescribed, and moreover, the answers are already written, and we could supply them without waiting for the parties to answer. If you watch enough of this stuff, I mean, I've become a CNN junkie, so now I can just give the report before they give it. I can just say, well, what happened in the war today? We won. Short summary of the news. Lots of them died, not many of us did. We won. You know, I mean, I heard that for 7 years earlier in my life. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, whenever you see a light at the end of the tunnel, philosophy reminds you that there is at least the dim possibility that the light at the end of the tunnel will turn out to be a cave. A candle at the end of a cave. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's going to come out on the other side of anything worthwhile. Okay, Socrates, know thyself, ask embarrassing questions, and yet try to avoid his fate, which is don't be tried, found guilty, and executed unless you're his age. So I want to leave you with a sort of joke about about philosophy for this first lecture, and that's that it's a very interesting question whether Socrates would have escaped from prison. Many of you know the story, and I didn't want to repeat it and waste my 45 minutes. It's a very interesting question about whether Socrates would have chosen to escape from prison, which was one of his choices, if he had been a 25-year-old inquirer as opposed to a 1 or 2-year-old inquirer. It would have been very interesting. I think the choice would have been quite different. He might then have considered some of his friends' plans to escape. Certainly we know that Aristotle later did. He fled Athens and said, I don't want them to sin twice against philosophy. And so that means that at some point I'll have to leave Duke so that they won't sin twice against irritating West Texans who are just interested in reading philosophy books, although I wouldn't say just. And I do think that the analogy that I'd like to leave your attention on is that this kind of critical inquiry, if it can be carried out at all, can be carried out when societies are troubled. In other words, when the meanings of words become topics for debate and redefinition, and that's not a matter of just debate, because the way we describe our lives and understand them is intimately and inextricably connected to the way we live them. You describe yourself as an insurance salesman. It's okay, I'm not mad at any of you if you do that, but that's all the description that you've got. That's going to structure a certain kind of life, that set of descriptions and those sets of beliefs. And I want to open up a possibility that there might be a way, even under these conditions, to expand such definitions. Maybe not eternal ones, but localizable and, to be American in the last instance, usable ones. In the last lecture, I tried to just make a few suggestive remarks in order to get us off the ground about what might be called the Greek way of life and different forms of human conduct, of which only one I suggested and discussed, and that was the Socratic life of inquiry. And I didn't mean by that life of inquiry an inactive life, an apolitical life, or one unconcerned with the state or with other humans. But in fact, I wanted to present it not as some academic debate, but as a life deeply immersed in your social situation and in your attempt to understand who you are and who your fellow citizens are. Among the values that Greek society held out, and as an answer, one possible, localizable, and possibly usable answer of what human life is about for the Greeks was, to sum it up in one word, and this will be all I'll have to say about Aristotle or Plato, is excellence. In a way, it's well known that the Greeks have an ideal of excellence, where by excellence the Greeks meant something like this: to be an all-rounder, you know, it's in sort of West Texas parlance, an all-rounder. Somebody that, you know, could write a country song, punch out a big guy, shoot a game of pool, work a full day's work, and was smart enough to read a thick book. And I don't mean to make it too mundane, because if you look at the description of Odysseus in Greek literature, that was sort of an ideal of excellence in their culture. And it's not like our ideal, because Odysseus was, one, a clever liar, two, someone who would cheat the gods when possible and necessary, who could drive a furrow, throw a discus, sail a boat, you know, and a bunch of things, right? And so for the Greeks, excellence was a whole series of traits of human beings, well-rounded in all respects, so that one of the great Greek tragedians was buried, and his marker remarked on what a great soldier and orator he had been, but said nothing about him winning the prize for the plays for which we know him today. So the Greeks had this idea of excellence, which to us can only be a pale shadow in a society where we mean something so radically different by excellence. By excellence, we would have to mean, and perforce have to mean, an excellent lawyer, an excellent politician, an excellent housewife, I'd rather say worker, an excellent house worker. It's hard to say worker when they're unpaid labor, but house worker and so on. But excellence in a society in which labor is greatly divided can only be, as it were, a pale shadow of this Greek ideal, okay? That doesn't mean that you can't be excellent at your job and learn to ski, but the Greeks meant a bit more by it than that. So what we'll pursue now in a discussion that unfortunately has to be far too brief will be ideals of excellence in a Roman society, and I'm going to run through those. Some of them are fairly well known to us today, so I'm going to run through a few of those ideals of human excellence. Again, localizable to the Roman Empire, again, very Western, you know, all traditional, no problem there. And then I'll end with a little intimation of something I'll try to pick up on again at the end of the lecture. Even though Christianity as a form of belief dominated Western civilization for so long, I'm going to have very little to say about it in the early part of the lectures for a reason I'll give you toward the end of this one. Okay, so now to move from the Greeks to the Romans, there are three different views I want to discuss in terms of how to conduct one's life, and two of them bear a nice historical parallel with conditions in the Roman Empire and its fate. One of the positions with which many of you are familiar, at least in name, because the word although it means something slightly different today. This position is probably familiar. One of the answers to how to live, given during the rise of the Roman Empire, when the markets were filled with goods and there was much to enjoy, even for some of the plebeians, there was much to enjoy because Rome was looting the world. Maybe some of you understand this condition from your experience, I don't know. But anyway, it was a good time philosophy. It was hedonism. Now, it's important to understand that philosophers of the old school make a living refuting hedonism, because how could a view about what is the best kind of life for humans or the right thing to do, and I'd like to make this simpler by just using Spike Lee's phrase, how could do the right thing mean do what makes you happy? But actually this view is harder to refute than one might think, because in answer to the problems of life, the hedonist response that you should do what makes you happy is actually a fairly powerful view, I think. Now, I think that it's more powerful under conditions where it's possible to do that, for obvious reasons. Now, the hedonists back up their arguments with two kinds of claims, and we'll return to this again when we get a kind of modern form of social hedonism in John Stuart Mill. But the hedonism of the Roman Empire was connected with various schools, the Epicureans and others, where we get the word epicure. And that ought to already tell you something about the kinds of pleasures to be pursued. And this will be disappointing to many of you. The kinds of pleasures the Epicureans wanted to pursue, and nearly every version of hedonism makes this distinction, were the higher pleasures, by which they meant the ones that don't have the negative payback. The higher pleasures are, as the word epicure indicates, excellent food in moderate quantity, like swordfish steak, just right, blackened a little, yuppified, just a little picante sauce, which has become quite popular, Tex-Mex variant. Just enough, though, to be healthy, good for the heart, a little running, and these things in moderation. A little learning, but not too much, not enough to trouble the mind, but enough to satisfy it. On the other hand, one wouldn't indulge in those pleasures that have a strong negative side. I mean, this is the way that the philosophical position is. Myself, I've always wanted some hedonist to just come out and say, I'm for the really gritty, ugly pleasures. I like them. But that's not a view. I mean, I would defend partially that view, but that's not a view that is, philosophically respectable, although it may be even more plausible. Now, the lower pleasures are things like getting dog drunk, which provides a lot of pleasure until the next morning. You get a lot of pain. Falling dumbly in love, which provides a lot of pleasure and then gives a lot of pain. These were to be avoided because they led to a troubled mind. So those pleasures were, as it were, not, this was a very rational position, see. The idea is to maximize one's pleasure, so you follow the most rational course to do that. You go after higher pleasures that don't have a bad downside, and avoid the so-called lower pleasures that have this downside. A good drunk, again, our culture is familiar with this, just say no to drugs. Well, the reason for that can't be that they don't make you feel good. I'm an old 60s person, and I know better. They make you feel good, but they have a downside. So I'm not arguing, don't charge the stage. I'm not saying say yes to drugs. I'm just saying you'd be a fool to say they don't make you feel good. They do make you feel good. You ought to tell the truth about some things once in a while. Hell, it won't hurt. Even in Reagan and Bush's America, it doesn't hurt to tell the truth once in a while. Just don't get caught by your friends, okay? In any case, the problem with drugs, though, is they have this downside. The cocaine blues is a familiar, not only country song, but phenomena. Way up, way down. This view of seeking pleasure was quite widespread in a period when Rome had a lot of pleasures to seek, booty from all over the world. During the decline of Rome, a rather different view of the best kind of life for human beings arose, and I'll discuss it briefly too. And then we'll compare them, because the comparisons are interesting. And that's Stoicism. And just like hedonism still means something like hedonism to us, when we call someone a Stoic today, it still means something like what they meant by it, Stoic. Now, it's important to see that there is a connection between these modes of beliefs and the social and historical conditions that people are actually responding to when they form these beliefs. So when less booty is available in Rome, and Caligula's wasting a lot of it anyway, and scaring the hell out of you, one way to respond is with a set of beliefs of Stoic fortitude. And the word is that was important for them and that they used to model their way of life on is not like for the Greeks, excellence, or for the hedonists, happiness. For the Stoics, the word was apatheia. Now, I'm saying it in its Latinate form rather than in English, because if I say it in English, it's apathy, and you get the wrong idea. For the Stoics, apatheia was something you cultivated, unlike our society where they cultivate it for us, but I mean, apathy was something you cultivated, and it didn't mean withdrawal, except in the sense of a courageous stance against, as it were, the buffeting powers of fate, over which you had no control, so the best one could do was to buck up and face a bad situation. Now, many of the Stoics, and I'm oversimplifying to get the arguments clear, certainly oversimplifying these two broad historical movements, but we've got to make the positions clear. Some of the Stoics thought, with the hedonists, that happiness would be the best thing, but they thought it was unattainable in this world. That's a very important belief structure given the next belief structure that will be historically dominant in Western civilization. That's a very important switch in belief, is that now happiness is still considered something that would be great if we could get it, but if you can't, the next best thing is to face up to it, you know, buck up. An attitude with which I'm still familiar, as I say, from my background, you know, sort of the Texas attitude toward a drought. Well, you can't be happy living out here, but damn it, they're not going to run me off this place. Well, that's kind of Stoic. There's nothing apathetic about it. I mean, the wind blew all the crops away. His farm's going, you know, 80 miles down the road. Is, you know, be happy about it would be crazy, but you can face it with some kind of courage, some kind of fortitude. So that was the Stoic ideal. So I say many of them believed happiness would be good, but was not possible. So their arguments for that are based on two things, one of which you may have already caught me on, and I hope you have, is that for the Stoics, the distinction between higher and lower pleasures is dubious, is questionable. Where do you really draw the line with that one? Why and why? I mean, are there any pleasures that don't have a downside? And for the Stoics, there aren't. There are none. Even, you know, enjoying Beethoven's Fifth requires lots of work to get in a position to enjoy it. You know, you don't just walk in and go, well, some people do who like to bluff. They go, ain't that great? It's like the first time I ever heard it. Oh, yeah, I love it. No, to really enjoy it and to get pleasure from it requires listening to a lot of things first. To really enjoy Moby Dick is more than just seeing the excellent movie by John Huston, written by Ray Bradbury. You have to actually read Moby Dick, and it's long, and there are sections in it about rendering whales, and that goes on about 200 pages, and you got to get through them. They're important to the story, and so that's work, you know. And so for the Stoics, there's not this simple distinction between higher and lower pleasures. All pleasures have, as it were, a downside, all of them. And for people who try to lead a single-minded life of happiness or pleasure, who set that out as their goal, may fall victim to an old Eastern proverb from Eastern philosophy, and that's that chasing happiness is like chasing your own shadow. It's almost as if one could get still, one might be able to find it, but if you keep chasing it, it's always a little bit ahead. Well, the Stoics had some view like that about happiness. You chase it, it runs. So the Stoic answer was to lead this courageous life of, You know, it sounds a little corny, but it's not any cornier than let's buck up and take it, guys. Sort of a male kind of thing, you know, I have to admit. It's definitely, well, it's sexist, like most of this tradition. In any case, that was the view, and it's important to see when the two views were popular and in what ways. One view corresponded to a rising empire and its values. The other view was more prevalent during a falling or declining empire and with its values. So, in modern parlance, one might expect in a society on the ascendancy to have all kinds of optimistic values. In that regard, let me quickly refer you to the commercials that were made in the 1950s, especially those 1950s commercials that projected what life would be like in the year 1990. We're there now, and we look back at those commercials, and guess what? They missed it, right? It was wrong. They missed it. They missed it a long way. You can even look at the Jetsons and go, they even missed that. They missed it. The future didn't turn out to be like they imagined it. Very optimistic account of the future. In this current period, to try to again drive my analogy home about how ways of thinking and views of human conduct are rooted in real life problems, in real social and political problems, in our current period, in what form do we imagine our futures? One of the most striking examples to me here are the new movies that I call near future movies. My favorite is Blade Runner. Now, Blade Runner, I don't know how many of you have seen it, is a magnificent film for this simple reason. It is post-apocalyptic, bored with the apocalypse. There's not going to be a nuclear war because the world's not that interesting. See, that's already sort of more cynical than many of us would want to be. The world's not interesting enough for us to enjoy the sting of a real death. Instead, we'll have this decline and smudge into the life where our lives and the lives of machines will become ever more blurred, as it is becoming. So in Blade Runner, we get just a near-future projection that shows us what Los Angeles would look like in 30 years if things just keep going on the way they do. You don't need any apocalypse to watch Blade Runner. You just need to say, well, it's going to get more polluted, more crowded, and more people from more places are going to come there, and they're going to make more money, and it's going to look like that. And then you got Blade Runner. So those near futures help to say something about how we see our future as a culture, as opposed, for example, to the culture of the 50s. Now, in my view, other cultural artifacts like the apocalypse movies were really ways to dodge the sticky and ugly task of facing a plausible near future. See, the easiest way to do this is to have a big apocalypse and start all over, and then you don't have to face all the nasty questions about what's really going to happen if things just grind on. So Blade Runner would be an example I'd use there to try to remind you that our culture, too, has different views that code different periods in its rise, decline, and so on. And it's not unusual. So in the Roman case as well, toward the declining period of Rome, Stoicism became a dominant view. Now, there's a very positive thing to say about Stoicism. It has a deeply democratic side to it, egalitarian side better, since the word democracy has become polluted through misuse and so on. What word hasn't, but it in particular. It has an egalitarian aspect to it. The two most famous of the Stoic philosophers, one was a king and one was a slave. Now, the beauty of that was as follows, that they were brothers in suffering. Both would have to put up with outrageous, with what Shakespeare, Hamlet, calls the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. King's life's full of troubles. Shakespeare again says, the uneasy sets the crown upon the head. So the king needs to be a Stoic because, man, he's got troubles. And of course the slave does too. And this view has beneath it an egalitarian notion that we're alike in a couple of respects. We're all going to have troubles, and then there is that absolutely democratic institution that, as far as I know, hasn't been abolished yet, and it's death. the one absolutely democratic institution on the planet. I mean, isn't that beautiful? In a way, rather than to be sort of existentialist about it, that sort of dress in black 60s attitude about it, I mean, death is a kind of utopian concept for me because even the rulers have to face it. I mean, I actually laugh, and some of you must too, when you see the poster, "He who dies with the most toys wins." You know, you go, well, that's kind of a relief, you know. In the end, Trump just has like 3 limousines at his funeral. Well, at the rate Trump's going, he may only have 1. But in any case, the point is that there is a democratic institution, widely respected by us and feared, even when we don't want to think or talk about it much. And beneath it, as I will argue later, there's a greater danger. Okay, I've talked about hedonism, and I've talked about Stoicism. The important connection I want to make is it seems difficult to imagine how on the ruins of the Roman Empire Christianity could have arisen and conquered and had its conditions conquered so quickly in the West. I mean, that really is a rather remarkable historical, you know, turn of events. That a slave religion banned throughout the empire will end up being adopted and then spread. Now, we don't want to be too mystical about this because the historian Gibbon said that it spread not by the preaching of the word, but by fire and the sword. That is a way to spread certain doctrines. I read the paper this morning. You can still spread a doctrine that way. Not simply through the preaching of the word on TV, but fire and the sword are sometimes handy. There's more than one way to convince someone, in short. I'm arguing that there are preferable ways to do it. But in any case, Stoicism helps us to understand this. During the declining part of the Roman Empire, the Stoics account of their social reality and of the limited chances for happiness within it. You know, this courage, apatheia, was also backed up with an almost, and here I'm going to use the Americanized version, existentialist view that sort of all is vanity. So for me, a classic Stoic doctrine, you can all go back and read during break. It's not an assignment. It's in every motel. It's the Gideon Bible. Open your Gideon Bible, find the book of Ecclesiastes, and read Ecclesiastes. It is a magnificent Stoic doctrine because it says vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Pretty big statement. All. The guy goes, look, I had money, but that was vanity. I gave myself to no knowledge. That was vanity. All is vanity. Well, that interesting old text helps to explain why the Stoics were ready to hear, finally, the message of the Christians, which about the world was the same. In other words, St. Augustine's account of this world and the Stoics' account are the same. Augustine calls this world the region of unlikeness. Everything's garbled up, messy, based on a text of St. Paul's, you know, we see through a glass darkly, you know. And so I want you to see that Stoicism, as it were, prepared really fertile ground for the preaching of the word of the early Christians. And the reason it did, it seems to me, simple, because the Stoics had a problem but not a good answer. Namely, they had a good account of the problem, and then along come these weirdos who you've been previously hunting down and killing, and they go, wait a minute, now listen to us again. We know when you had all your power, this didn't sound so smart. Now you might want to listen. And then the answer comes, but there's good news. Although there's a world like this one, there's another one. When we discuss Freud, we'll understand why humans sometimes make such projections. While this world isn't working out, there's another one, and while justice won't be rewarded here, it will be rewarded there. While happiness isn't possible here, the right kind of life will give it to you there. So if you read Ecclesiastes all the way to the end, the reason Ecclesiastes is not finally a Stoic doctrine is because the preacher has the hope in his heart that the Messiah will come and there'll be an answer to these problems But with the Stoics, they both agree about the world that we're all in now, the mundane world that we're in now, that it's a bad show, not working. So that is the way in which these movements, and that's a very brief account, but that's the way in which these three answers to the human conduct arose in succession, sort of, not rapid succession. These were massively long historical movements, many variants. And when I say movements, you've got to remember that as long as I'm discussing Greek society, Roman society, and medieval society, you have to point out that you talk about movements among people who think, you're only talking about a very limited number of folks. Not in terms of them thinking, but in terms of us having any record of it. For all I know, they thought more and better about all of this, but it seems to me that Marx has a banal truth down. I know today it's not popular to say Marx got anything right. But one thing certainly I think Marx got right was that as far as the history of ideas go, the ruling ideas in each epoch are basically the ideas of the ruling classes. The dominant ones. Not all the ideas, but the dominant ideas of each historical period will be the ideas discussed by the dominant classes. The reason that's not a surprising thesis is that the women are out having babies this fast, and that's almost biologically required as well as required by patriarchy for a society to continue. It's required by both. Doesn't justify it, it's barbaric. And then slaves are doing necessary labor without which you do not have the leisure to pursue philosophy. It's important to remember this is a leisure activity. Without leisure time, you can't pursue it. It may be why we don't have a very philosophical culture now. It's because we work longer and harder now than we did 40 years ago. I think that's right statistically, although there must be a sociologist somewhere in the crowd. But it's right according to the advertisements I've been seeing on TV. That as it were, brag about it. We now work 65 hours a week. And I went, oh, joy. That's a real thrill. Glad it's going up. Hope you guys can get it back up to where it was when Dickens wrote. Congratulations. I'm sorry I'm off on a screed now. I'll have to come back to the point. My mind wanders. I don't know. It's watching too many Robin Williams skits. Anyway, these three forms of human conduct. The last, and that's the slow ascendancy of Christianity, spread by both the preaching of the word and fire and the sword, based on a mystery wrapped in an enigma, and very confusing one at that. And we will discuss that later. Not tomorrow, not on the first day. You don't do the God stuff on the first day. We'll do it in a more modern context when I think I'll throw in a few remarks about Kierkegaard, who's a philosopher who gives a stunning attempt to defend Christianity in an era in which he says, because all are Christians, ipso facto none are, which I think is a quite elegant and correct argument. Structurally, it is. It's very interesting. Well, we'll discuss that later. It's a snotty thing to say, but it's worth saying. So the Christian era, and here's a vast wealth of views about the best kind of life for human beings in the medieval period. Modernist scholars who will concentrate on the figures that I will after break, Kant, Mill, and others, vastly underestimate both the diversity of knowledge in the medieval period and what it discovered in the sciences and so on. Now, we are right that it was the Dark Ages in terms of the political dimensions I've been mentioning, but then we hardly have room to throw stones in that regard today either. So the Dark Ages is overkill. In the medieval period, there are a lot of views, but it is fair to say, along with the sociologist Max Weber, that the Middle Ages were somehow enchanted. Now, by that he meant that at the center of the ideologies in the West, remember, as we do philosophy, it's a Western discourse, okay? It doesn't mean that no other people in the world are good enough to do it. It means that's the way we have understood it here, and it certainly doesn't mean that our way of doing it and understanding it is at all right. I'll come around to that, but only at the last lecture when we go back over this train of doing Western philosophy. But In the West, it's important to remember that this period was much more variegated than the simple Dark Ages account. The medievals, though, did live in a world kind of enchanted by an overarching belief system which can be seen not just in their religious texts, in other words, not just in philosophy, although there it's beautifully expressed by Aquinas, better expressed by Augustine, one of my favorite writers, but by Aquinas, and then towards the late medieval periods, Duns Scotus and others, St. Bonaventure and many other great writers, and some of whom disagree quite wildly on many things. And that period produces one of the most elegant arguments in the whole philosophical tradition, and that's St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, which is the closest thing we have in philosophy to a knockdown argument. It argues God exists, and I'll have time. I'll run through it briefly here in a second. But anyway, I'm trying to, as I say, draw this 2,000-year period to a close in modernity, because while this period is enchanted around a set of beliefs at which various Christian views are at the center, and in which society is, again, sort of hierarchically arranged with differential relations to God, and yet each one of those mediated relations confers meaning. In other words, meaning not in some small sense like, well, my life has meaning, I've got a good job and a lot of friends. No, meaning in the sense that you were an actor in a cosmic drama in which your decision to sin or not to sin, to be saved or not to be saved, was crucially important in a big cosmic drama, which while your everyday life might be really bad, corvée labor was no fun, while that might not have been so hot, there was a way that your life had some structure of meaning. Also, in this period of Western Civ, and I think this is clearly right, because all things were seen to be created, right, then even the very rocks and stones, St. Francis and all this, the birds, the rocks, the trees, the stones, all were signs of God. Now, that view of Christianity continues on at least till Melville. Why do you think he's so mad at Moby Dick? The good old normal New Englander goes, well, I don't understand. Starbuck goes to Captain Ahab, why are you so mad at a poor dumb fish that did but strike thee out of blind instinct? And Ahab just says, you're crazy. All things are guided by this. Of course, he doesn't say the word God. That would have been a little over the edge. By some inscrutable power that has hounded and dogged us since first we walked upon this earth. It is the thing behind the fish I chiefly hate, which, of course, explains why Melville thought he had written a very nasty book. He had, for that period. In any case, the world of Melville that he evokes there and the previous in the medieval period, which I don't think was in some practical ways at all over by then, and in some ways still isn't over, was an enchanted world. By enchanted, I don't want you to get the happy idea that that's a Walt Disney notion of it. But it does contrast with what Max Weber will talk about when I discuss these modern philosophers, and that's a disenchanted world. And my easiest and quickest way to give you Max Weber on this is to suggest two things. One, a disenchanted world is one in which there's a place for everything and everything's in its place, where quantitative relations of numerical ones, are more important than qualitative ones, by and large, where rules and procedures are followed, period. That's procedural rationality for Weber. Characterizes bureaucracies and economies. Rules are followed, period. It's a principle of them. But without giving you a lot of Max Weber, I can simply refer you to a better critic of bureaucracy, Franz Kafka. So if you want to read Before the Law or The Trial, you get a better sense for how just exactly how disenchanted modern institutions can appear. I mean, it is true that the justice of the medieval period was arbitrary, but while it was arbitrary, there was something human about it. In other words, it could take account of differences. Under procedural justice, if you've ever been in traffic court, you know how that works, right? Driving drunk, 1 year in jail, $100 fine, probation. 1 year in jail, $100 fine, probation. Nobody cares why you were drunk. They don't care if Uncle Henry died. Nothing, doesn't matter, because they have a procedure and they follow it. That's a disenchanted world, one in which the rules are there. Now, in not all respects do I mean to say that's worse than an enchanted one. Not at all. I just mean that from our perspective now, we don't want to call that modern life that's so hot, and this other stuff the Dark Ages. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. Okay. So if one wanted a sort of moniker for the whole medieval period, in one way or another, the imitation of a life like Christ guides that period, to the extent that it's possible for whoever can do it, and to the extent that various groups start demanding a role in that life, because struggle plays a role in each one of these social formations that I'll have to wait until I discuss Marx to get around to, but I'm willing to wait. Real movements for democracy are, oddly enough, most threatening in nominal democracies. That's a principle of Hegelian discourse. In other words, if you live by an ideology, the most dangerous ideology to you is your own, because someone may expect you to do what you say. So, in that sense, communist ideology, as many of you know, was never a real threat in the United States, right? Very few communists got elected to Senate and so on. It was just not really popular. On the other hand, our own ideologies of democracy, freedom, and equality have been a great danger to our own society. So that's a dialectical truth, and leads me into Marx and Marx's criticism of capitalism, because there's a wide misunderstanding, and I need to explain why a criticism of capitalism is a criticism of Hegel. Because for Hegel, if that was the highest expression of humanity, was this advent of capitalism, the liberal democratic state, and so on, then a criticism of that state, you know, which had been based on the previous French Revolution and so on, would be a criticism not just of Hegel, but of the state of affairs his philosophy represented. And that was Marx's real point, and not just merely to interpret Hegel or criticize him, but use him as a vehicle to criticize the actual state in terms of the degree to which at first, it's an internal criticism. It's a criticism of the gap between the promises of the bourgeois state and its practices. And that criticism is launched in terms of the economy. The argument is rather elegant and rather simple. And I mean, Marx has many complicated arguments. I'm going to stick to a few from this book, The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Marx. It's an inexpensive little book. The problem is that the democratic state is, and Marx uses a rather strong word here, in contradiction with the imperatives of the capitalist economy. Now, I'm not sure many people would even want to disagree with that anymore. I think that we're used to living in a sort of televised environment in which contradictions don't bother us as much as they used to. They just make us twinge. In other words, we'll see a huge picture of rubble on TV, and a spokesman will be saying, there was no rubble, and the rubble's behind you. And we're used to that now. We've lived through periods where Richard Nixon would come on TV and say, I am not a liar. Then his eyes would drift off, you know. So we're more used to contradiction than they were, and take it less seriously. We expect it. In fact, certain cultural artifacts of our period, like Twin Peaks, make a joke out of our ability to accept contradiction. They use it in a way as a kind of irony on our society, that we can accept it with very little difficulty. But this wasn't true in this period, so it was an important criticism if Marx could show that the imperatives of the economy to accumulate human labor, which for Marx was the key to capital, not accumulating money, because money was a medium, right, that was used to accumulate living labor. That's what is the fundamental meaning of the alienation of labor for Marx. To put it in really basic terms, it's this. The secret to capitalism is moving from a society, and this is why it has ethical implications, that I'd like to draw. Moving in a society where the question is, what are you, to a society in which the question is, what do you own or have? What do you do in the sense of a career, a job, or whatever? Once human beings are redescribed in that way, they're redescribed in terms of their work time, which is not voluntary. I mean, you know, Reagan recognizes that, right? He distinguishes voluntarism from work. He's that smart. And we all know when we're at work, we're not volunteering. And one way you can know, no matter how much you love your job, everybody always tells me I love my job, that very few people, when they're given 2 months off at full pay, decide to come in every day and work their butt off. It's just, we Americans may love their jobs, but they may also have deep psychological reasons to believe that compensatory thing, namely that they do really love it. They may, in fact, be devious in some respect. It's deeper than a conscious one, which we'll discuss when we get to Freud. So for Marx, the crime, as it were, that capital commits, and it's not I shouldn't even use the word crime, because it's purely systemic, and it has dual effects, one of which is incredibly positive. The negative effect it has is to reduce the rich amount of human needs to needs that can simply be bought and sold on a marketplace. In other words, to make us understand our needs in terms of marketable needs. And this is almost a boring lecture now, because our need for love, compassion, understanding, for social relations, and so many other needs now are all merchandisable. I mean, even if you, one of the kinkiest things people used to do, which is to have intimate sexual conversations with one another, now that's telephonized and you put it on your visa, right? I mean, just think of that one example about telephone sex. This is how far capitalism can go in rationalizing what at one time was a very intimate personal exchange without the mediation of money into one that becomes marketable. So if you're watching USA on television late at night, which I sometimes do, it's got all those stupid B-movies on it, then here come on a whole stream of lovely young men and women saying, call me up. $5 a minute. So if you're lonely, sad, tired, want a friend, there's one on the market. That's the way in which Marx saw relations, as it were, between things, because commodities are things, even when it's us. You know, if you're in a room full of people who sell insurance and you're trying to hire one of them and you're the executive, you're choosing between commodities. Now, someone will immediately object, of course, one of the people there may have a better personality. Great. That means that that's a feature of that commodity that's attractive to you as a buyer. That's why the person may get the job. So for Marx, that was the violence it committed, was it not only commodified our relations but our lives, and put the pursuit of things in the place of a whole host, and in place of a whole host of other needs, desires. In fact, the desire just for social relations themselves, which today is a real desire. Just the desire for a genuine social relation or two. One or two genuine social relations. So now that was the bad part on the social relations side for Marx. That's where capitalism was at loggerheads with the great ideals of freedom and so on, is because such human beings under such an economic system, because of competition with one another for what jobs were available in order to survive within such an economy, where working could only be called free labor as a kind of a joke. In other words, that whether we work or not, whether we make that as a choice is sort of a joke, right? Well, I can choose not to work. Well, the streets last night, as this city froze, were full of people who, I'm sure many didn't choose not to work, right? I doubt that a lot of them are lazy. Like Jesse Jackson, I don't think that that's the problem with poor people, is that they're lazy. But in any case, if you choose not to work, you may very well find yourself under a bridge at night. One way you can find out, by the way, and this is simple to cut through a lot of the crap you usually hear about class analysis, and there are no classes in America. Here's a little empirical test for the audience to try. Don't work for 8 years. Stop working. And if really bad things happened to you, you were in the working class. If at the end of the 8 years everything's fine and dandy, you still got a house and a car and a nice place to live and a lot of nice friends, then you were okay. Otherwise, you were in the working class. But if you stop working for that long and you're in deep trouble, you were a worker and didn't know it. That's a nice empirical test, and I challenge any of you to try it. Someone who denies that there are classes can always give this one a shot. It's a way to find out if there are. Really find out. So those are some of the downsides. Classes are produced with unequal power. Social relations become, as it were, reified, frozen, phony, if you will. The upside is the upside that where Marx, I think, praises capitalism in terms beyond those ever used by William Buckley as a system that had produced from nature more wonders, more technological wonders than the whole previous history of the world had seen. In other words, the good things capitalism did was to build railways, medicines, and even more importantly, new needs. See, many of you may think that all this sort of negative talk's kind of, oh, left wing, all whining after Bush. We shouldn't whine like that. We should be really happy about it. You know, 1,000 points of light, that vision thing. But the upside of this is that new needs get produced. And for Marx, that was a revolutionary process because the system would never, as productive as it is, there'd be no way it could ever catch up to the level of need produced by it. Have you ever noticed that? Now think about, here's another example to think about, please. Remember how good stereo sounded when you first got it instead of mono? You know, mono just played as one sort of flat music. Mono sounded okay when you first got it because it was better than that scratchy thing like this. And you got your first stereo and it was so exciting, and nobody even mentioned that the tapes you played on your stereo had a little hiss in them. But now to just put a tape in something, you hear that hiss, and you think about your friends that have a CD and they don't have that hiss. So there's a new need now for hissless music. All around music. A whole new need. I mean, the book here, the one that I've discussed, has an account of the alienation of labor. That wouldn't go over very well in Stalin's Russia because the fundamental insight here is that if you are working your fanny off on a shop floor in Kiev, it's hard to know how you're in a worker's paradise when someone in Detroit's working their fanny off there. The view that from the bottom up is the one that seems to me plausible. Under both conditions, something important about your humanity is being lost. Under both conditions. And when we look at the conditions I'm discussing today, we're not looking at abstract moral conditions. I'm not offering a grand abstract theory of them. I'm trying to give something like a rough account of the fabric of daily life. A rough account of it. Because it's too rich. Especially in this country, once you get off the interstate, the fabric of daily life is very rich. Something like the distinction I'd want to make between a sort of theoretical approach and an approach more rooted in daily life to the issues that we'll be discussing, I'm just laying some of them out now, is the difference between driving cross-country on the interstate or flying over it and then occasionally taking the back roads. This is very interesting driving through the South, but it's also interesting driving through the Midwest. Because the United States is not the kind of country. You notice how after Hegel we've started giving a theory of the present and stuff? See, that was what we promised we'd do, is that philosophy at its best should be our time comprehended in thought. That keeps it from being what Nietzsche says, sort of a museum of ideas. He says, you know, which is built for loafers in the garden of knowledge. Nietzsche's right. Well, for philosophy to be more than that sort of museum of ideas built for loafers in the garden of knowledge, it needs to give an intransigent account of conditions in the present. Now, it could be wrong, okay? I told you I was a fallibleist. What I'm saying now could be wrong, but that shouldn't be decided by slogans or TV commercials. or by willy Horton ads, but by debate, by argument among a public body, public citizens talking and arguing. Now, the further problem, and this is a problem that Marx in part is implicated in, is the way in which political discourse has, as it were, dried up and narrowed. The things about which we can debate, the topics which are open for alternatives and for other explanations and descriptions. And this is the deep sense in which I have used the word pseudo-democracy instead of democracy throughout. Because even in its Greek form, where it was limited only to Greeks who were citizens, not slaves or not foreigners, even there, the institutions of representation where people could be recalled much quicker. See, it's hard to recall someone who, once they get in this city. Not many people come back. We didn't like it. And again, why not? Well, because in the current situation, as many events that have just happened, I think, indicate political power and economic power are deeply interlocked. It seems to me hardly accidental that most of the people in the Senate are millionaires. I think all but what? One or two? They're all millionaires. Is that just an accident? An accidental relation? Most of them white guys, notice that? Accidental relation? No. See, that's the kind of prima facie evidence one should look at. You should go, well, that just looks like a bunch of white guys at some really rich club in New York. Well, it is like them. In fact, when they go to New York, it is them. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory because all of them appear on TV and tell you they're running your lives, so it's not a conspiracy. The deep insight Marx has, and it's really an important one, is that whatever, and by the way, this is not a sufficient condition for what we would like to call a good or excellent human life, but it's a necessary condition. Necessary but not sufficient. Is that you not have your life reduced to total poverty. That's this, in other words, it's not enough to just be free from constraints. You can't be just reduced to penury and then say that that person has a free life. And on the other hand, you can't have your life reduced to work, no matter how high the wage, and have it be a really excellent life. That reduction of life to work itself cripples life and cripples the challenge to become something else, larger, other. And it's only in that sense that we started with these philosophical ideals, because each one of them points the way at projects other than, right? Other than simply being the person who sold the most tires, who pushed the most papers through the largest office. Each one of them. In that regard, let me refer back to a really old one, Alexander the Great, on finding a skeptic in the streets, a really famous philosopher. And this guy was really just totally otherworldly. All he did was just think and lay in the streets, and he was really dirty. And some of Alexander the Great's officers, and by the way, Alexander the Great did better than George Bush ever will. Conquered the whole world, you know, and he was like, what, 26 or so. Younger than Dan Quayle, probably just as sharp. And he sees this old philosopher lying in the streets, and he says, well, if I wasn't Alexander, I would want to be that man. The reason is that they both had extreme and extremely interesting projects. It's hard for us to even have a sense for a project like that now, because our projects have been reduced to a series of bills, petty annoyances, and in our spare time, the search for what little meaning is left over from all that busyness and chatter that goes into that process. Now, this is not, I mean, I'm aiming it at this audience because we're here. So please don't get confused. I'm not a foreign agent. I don't know a government in the world where I couldn't say similar things, and in most governments, some worse. Now, I don't want any complacency about my lecture or that to be viewed as me pulling back from what I've said. What I've been trying to fill out today for you is a richer notion of freedom in which we recognize that before moral problems really come up in the philosophical sense, before they really come up, there are conditions for human life that have to be fulfilled, which I call necessary human requirements. They're not sufficient to live a good life, but they're necessary. Among them are food, shelter, ordinary health care. Real exciting, huh? See, that's not as much fun as Kant, but they're real important. Because without that, it's hard to follow the categorical imperative. You know, it's easier to follow a ham sandwich without that. So that's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a good life. It's also, and this is a more radical claim, it's also a necessary but not a sufficient condition that one have the freedom in one's life to pursue other goals than work. And in a strong sense, I'm not talking now about getting a hobby, but a life not reduced to work. Not reduced to work. A life where when you go to a cocktail party and they don't go, what are you? They go, what do you do? And you don't have to answer with your job description, which is another way of asking, who are you in a metaphysical sense, right? That accounts for a lot of the Phil Donahue shows. Women show up and are embarrassed to go, I'm a home worker. I work at home. Why would that be a problem? Well, in a capitalist economy, it's a terrible problem, and here's why. Because housework is unwaged. And since we value labor by the wage it brings, it's not surprising that an old person in a rest home's ability to tell a beautiful story is not valued because it's not waged. You go to an old folks' home. We ought to realize this. We'll all be we'll either be old or we'll face another alternative that's unpleasant. You go to an old folks' home, that's unwaged labor. They're whittling and they're storytelling. Not valued in our culture, in our society. It's not waged. Housework, no matter how many kids you raise, not really valued. Oh, come on, they'll say something about you on the Today Show if you live to be 100. This woman lived to be 100 and had 9 kids. And you get a little clap, that's it. Other than that, very little social value. All that unwaged labor. The reason it's not valued is because it's not waged. Donald Trump, he opens a hotel. Huge wage, huge wage, huge value to his labor. Well, what the hell did he do? Talk to Merv Griffith in a room for 3 minutes. And that's more valuable than some old man who's lived 90 years worth of experience and can tell a story about his life in which you might find a human meaning. A society that produces that situation is pathological. It neither has nor deserves a very long existence.